hope you can. This is my podcast, and I'm live here on Facebook and Instagram as well. Okay, so I will be speaking about the anatomy of Muslim slaves' lives in America before emancipation. Okay, it's a little bit of history and it's a little bit of the slave narrative, but let me just provide you with more information on what I'm going to be speaking about during this podcast. So, the story of Muslim lives in America has various narratives that provides us with records of beliefs, their literacy, their identity, right? So there was a lot of slaves in America, and why I want to focus on Muslim slaves is because there seems to be a certain gap in the, literature world per se, and a lot of people are not talking about it. So, I'd like to bring this up. So this podcast will look into the Muslim slaves in America before the emancipation, because there's a underlying gap narrative of their lives. So there's evidences, there's historical text, there's letters, pictures, information of how they lived in the new world. Okay, and I'll also be speaking about particularly a couple of slaves. There's a lot of slaves and their biographies and autobiographies and memoirs and all that stuff, but I'll be laser focused on slaves who were Muslims by faith, okay? And they were namely Job ben Solomon, Abdul Rahman Ibrahim, Omar bin Said, Osman Esquash, Nicholas Said, Old Lizzie Gray, Patience Spalding, Bilali, and I will be also speaking about women slaves particularly. I think this goes a little brushed off for some reason. I think there needs to be some sort of a women narrative in the slave, which is very key, in order for us to open the doorway to tell the stories of how they lived in the New World, which is America, right? So Islam did not have a clear narrative per se in the early American history. Okay, and I'll be quoting some of the authors and the books that I've written. Okay, and also articles too. Michael A. Gomez. Okay, he's a very profound writer, and he's a contributor of American slave narrative per se. And I would highly recommend his books. Michael A. Gomez. He's actually a very good writer. So one of his books that I was reading about is called Muslims in Early America. You can get a hold of it in, I think, on PDF format in Kindle or Amazon or some kind of an ebook website, I think. Anyways, Michael A. Gomez, he goes on to say that, and I quote, "One of the belief systems introduced into the Americas by Africans was Islam. However, the dawn of Islam in Americas and its associations with Africans have yet to receive a scholarly attention." See, this is why I want to actually point out, because there seems to be a literature gap here in the narrative per se in slavery. And it needs to be merited based on authors, based on, slaves who had families, who, recorded transcripts, writings and all that kind of sort, okay? So this is particularly true in the North American narrative per se, and the North American historical studies in which, one rarely reads of the early existence of Islam in what would become the United States of America, right? Here's another author, actually. I just want to point this out. Sylvain A. Diouf, Diouf. I think she's one of my favorite slave narrative writers, for me at least personally. I think she's a very good writer, and if you want to have a look at it, I think you can find her books everywhere. Sylvaine, okay? If you want if you want me to write down, I can always comment down below as well. Sylvain A. Diop emphasizes on a lack of scholarly attention, particularly with the Muslim slave narrative in America, per se. And I think a lot of authors actually point this out. That's why I'm bringing this issue here, okay? Actually, she argues that, and I quote, but for all their accomplishments and contributions to the cultures of the African diaspora, the Muslims largely have been ignored, unquote. So this suggests like an ongoing negligence of the Muslim slave narrative and the lack of interest in Islam in America, per se, and particularly, if you think about, we're not talking about, a 9/11 per se. After 9/11 was actually the animosity was heightened up, which everybody knows that. But before 9/11, I think it was also, sort of a taboo kind of thing in America per se. And so, by telling this story in my podcast, hopefully I'll help my viewers and my friends and my fellow compatriots. Hopefully you guys will gain a better understanding of how the Muslims lived in America, how they thrived, how they struggled. So my time period for this historical narrative would be before the Emancipation. All right, okay. So in 1400s, okay, so let's sort of like go back a little bit. In the 1400s, slaves from Africa, all right, were sold into the Atlantic slave by the Portuguese. So actually, if you think about the, slavery, you would think like, it's in the South, Mississippi, Louisiana, Kentucky, Carolina, all that kind of stuff. But if you really have to go back in the historical narrative of the Muslim slaves, particularly the African Muslim slaves who came from, West Africa, were actually people who moved to, the whole Atlantic slave trade were done by the Portuguese traders. So, the Portuguese people had a knack actually at the get-go before Americans started doing the slave trade. Well, actually, if you have to go back in the historical narrative, you have the book of Genesis, where it talks about Joseph's story as a slave in Potiphar's house, per se, and also, there is this slave narrative, even in the Arab countries and many of the Middle Eastern countries, biblically and non-biblical books as well. So yeah, there you go. It was a bustling market, and the slave value was at very high those days. Okay, so slaves who were sold into slavery, they were very, very expensive. So there were many black slaves who were being sold in Lisbon. Okay, into the Atlantic. Okay, so you have the Atlantic, you have the sea, but usually you call it the Atlantic slave trade. Okay, that's one of the lingos that we use here. So out of the many slaves that were shipped into the New World, guys, so my New World is basically the Americas, okay, the North America, and maybe the South America too. A significant number of them were Muslims. So I'm going to quote some of the numbers that I've actually found out during my research from some of the authors, okay. It is estimated, okay, so this is according to Alan D. Austin in his book, African Muslims in Antebellum America, Transatlantic Stories and Spiritual Struggles. This was published during 2011, and actually you can get a Kindle edition of it if you want. So he says that, I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit here. It is estimated that Muslim slaves that were shipped in America were around 40,000 from a total of 11 million slaves before 1860. Since their arrival into the plantations in America, their stories have not been discussed as often as non-Muslim slaves. So here again, what we encounter here is another author here who kind of points out that, the slave narrative, particularly among the Muslims, who were in service, not told as per, the authors, or, into the mainline literature, right? Or the mainline, academia per se. So anyways, this podcast will address the lives of Muslim slaves, okay? I'm going to give you a little bit of evidences, okay, as far as my research is concerned. All right. So, guys, on behalf of all my viewers, I'd like to point out some people here who have been waving. So I can see Ayan Lemtur, I can see Gabby here, I can see Cocker Tanya Cocker, okay. I can see Martin as well, Martin, my old friend from America. We have Jameer Sangla. Okay, we have. I think we have a couple of people who's live. So, guys, if you have any questions, any comments, feel free to write it down below the comment section. I can always read it, and I can actually reply to you back. Let's have a healthy conversation here. So, the evidences and sources at hand that I've actually researched. Okay. We will try to investigate and try to find out how slaves lived during the early period in America, before emancipation. It will focus also. So now the investigation part starts. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll try to focus on the lives of Muslim slaves. Okay, individual Muslim slaves that I've mentioned to you about in the beginning, and try to look further into the community and their residents as well. So we're trying to. So number one, okay, let's try to have a strategy here, and I actually have a strategy, a game plan, sort of. Number one, what we're going to do is it will take an approach on the literary aspect of their lives and ways of their. So it wasn't an easy thing for the slaves to survive. Okay. Second, it will illuminate the notion of the religious conversions, or in other lexicon, or the practice of dual faith in Islam and Christianity. Third, it will delve into the lives of Muslim slaves women. I told you I will speak about Muslim slaves women, okay? And fourth, it will explore about their Christianity and their faith and their experiences and their treatments, and not just Christianity but the other faiths as well in the New World. Fifth, I will try to show again the livelihood of Muslims, and particularly I think I do have one story, one individual and his family. His name is Bilali. So I'll just get into it because there's some actually people who have done a lot of research on certain like slaves, individual slaves. So I won't go too much into detail on that. Now the literacy of among Muslim slaves were very common actually. If you think about it, the spread of Islam, the spread of the Mohammedans actually started from Mecca to Medina, and it moved all the way to so you would go this way, right? Okay, so you would go like all the way to the African continents, and that's how a lot of African people and African countries were educated in the Islamic faith. And it's a whole package of education. Let's just put it that way. So there's many evidences that shows that there were very literate Muslims in America. Okay, the significance of their knowledge to read and write was an important aspect of their livelihood. Okay, why? Because there's one author actually who pointed out that the Muslim slaves who were in servitude upon their master's wills or upon their master's contracts, most of them were very literate, and most of them actually as a script writer, sorry, as a bookkeeper, as a translator, all that sorts, instead of doing the hard labor in the cotton fields, right? Right. Now, so I already told you about the literate Muslim slaves, right? So let me just point out one guy, okay? So guys, I printed out some of the people here that you might have a kind of like a pictorial understanding, or like physical, not physical, but a picture kind of memory that might be instilled in you. So these are some of the slaves. This is Abdul Rahman Ibrahim. Okay. Can you see? Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So this is one of them, and this is one of them, Omar bin Said. Okay. Is this clear enough? Is it too bright? Okay. There you go. I think you can see this. Okay. And these are some of the slaves in the market of Egypt. Okay, I think you can see this. Okay, you can see this. This is a slave bustling market in Cairo, Egypt. Okay. Okay, so let me just get into it again here. Nicholas said he was one of the few slaves who were very successful in learning English, and he was one of the only slaves actually who was actually becoming free, by his prowess on education and his literacy. Okay. So according to Alan D. Austin, I'm going to quote from his book again by African Muslims in Antebellum America. He points out that apparently, I quote, apparently, only Nicholas said he ever learned to write English well, unquote. So, most of the colored people were not very literate, okay, besides the Europeans, and, the white folks in America and many parts of the world. He was actually also given the opportunity, so we're talking about Nicholas said, okay, he was also given the opportunity to teach French in Detroit. Okay, it is also important to note that during that time, Nicholas Said's life, he was already experiencing the outbreak of civil war. So we're talking about civil war era during that time when, freed blacks, slaves particularly, were going to the north part of America because the north part of America was not as bad as in the south. Okay, there was more liberation for the servitude people up in the north, but not in the south. Okay. So, even for the Colored Regiment, which was part of the Union Army in 1867. Okay, so these were like very active American people who got their freedom and they were serving in the Union and all that kind of stuff. So the second one, who I'm going to talk about is Abdul Rahman. Okay, Abdul Rahman Ibrahim. So this is the man here. Is that? Okay, well, I think you might get the gist of it. This is not exactly him. I don't think I printed it out, but these are some of the people that I'll be talking to you about, okay? All right. So Abdul Rahman Ibrahim was a Muslim slave who was captured as a prisoner by a warlord and so sold into British slave trade. By the time he was in America, he was sold into Mississippi by a Mississippian slave owner. There are evidence that shows of his conduct of writing while he lived as a slave in America. So, like I said, some of the Muslims, I wouldn't say some, many of the Muslim slaves knew how to write very well, and they knew how to memorize, the books of Quran, like the whole Quran too. I tend to doubt the whole Quran every time I read something like that, but maybe people were, ardent or more dedicated to sort of, memorizing the whole book. Well, it was, faith and survival under siege, so I'm not very surprised sometimes. So Abdul Rahman Ibrahim, he was an author. He was a very literate slave. So I'm going to quote some of the historians that actually spoke about him. Okay, historians like Hodgson, Hodgson, had annotated translations of Ibrahim's Arabic writing. So he wrote in Arabic, by the way, which might have been very foreign in America during those days, I think. And the text was translated by Hodgson, and according to the translation, he says, I quote, from the Surat, he annotated translations of Ibrahim's Arabic writing, from Surat, sorry, revealed at Mecca. May Allah help Muhammad and his family and give them health and abundant blessings. Thus saith the Sheikh of Mecca. Okay, unquote. So this text had been said to be written by Ibrahim himself. Okay, so basically he was an ardent and a very devout Muslim, who believed in the Mohammedan principles. Okay, so also actually this text is said to have been written. This text had been actually found out and discovered by a person. His name is, actually it's Hodgson himself here. No, it's Al-Ahari. Al-Ahari, American American Orientalist Tree Slave Epistles from the Shifting Sands of Time. Okay, well, that's a long article here. Okay, so according to this article here, I'm just gonna point out, okay, here, whatever he says here. Upon further investigation on the slave writing, scholars have written accounts of literature Muslim slaves, okay. So according to this article here, it points out that Ibrahim was also called the prince in the New World after he was recognized of his abilities in writing Arabic. So if you think about it, Muslim slaves, they were very much, they were very much educated in a way that they maneuvered upon, a new society and how they went about actually people dawned on them as if, they were a prince because they spoke well, they dressed well, they behaved well, unlike, the unruly, slaves who were a little, not very civilized as per, the new civilization or the new world is concerned. Okay. Okay. Well, I have my cat here who is disturbing me, but I think, okay, maybe if he, all right, if he makes noise, I'll actually let him in. Okay, we have a lot of people who joined here. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, so enough about Ibrahim. Okay. So let me go delve into the Muslim slave women. So one of the Muslim slaves that I found during my research is old Lizzie Gray, who lived in the plantation during the 1800s, okay, until her death in the 1860s, okay. Old Lizzie Gray, okay. Her story depicts of a Muslim woman who believed in two religions. So there was like a duality of faith and survival. So, here's the thing about Muslim slaves who were living in the New World. They were persecuted in a way but they were persecuted also in another way because, they were not Christians, and, people who were following Mohammedan were actually frowned upon even during those days. Some of the examples how the societies were in America and how they treated the Muslims and people of the Mohammedan faith. Okay, so getting back on the old Lizzie Gray, who was a Muslim slave woman here, who lived in a plantation. So she was a mother of 4 children before she arrived from Africa during the Revolution. Lizzie was taken as a prisoner on board in the British ship and brought to America as a slave. It is said that she converted to Christianity and was attending a Methodist church. Okay, this could also suggest that the merging of religions helped her to live by means and customs of the New World. So again, let me point this out here. Sometimes it could be obligations. Okay, sometimes it could be obligations. And sometimes it could be out of survival that they actually, change their faith from Muslim to Christianity. Okay, because of their survival. She was 127 years old when she died in the farm of Dr. E.J. Mims Evidence of her obituary in the newspaper article was stated by her physician that she had a remarkable energy and lived as a Christian, okay? So, according to her physician's words, okay, she was educated in her youth under the influences of Mohammedan tenets, and although she united herself many, many years ago to the Methodist Church, she said, and I quote, that's literally from her words, that Christ built first church in Mecca, and his grave was there, unquote. So that's what she said, actually. But here's how the white Americans viewed Islam during its time. Let me get back to where I actually wanted to talk to you about. Here, I actually found out in one of my articles by Zafna. Actually, Zatnat Pania made a speech in Hartford on May 12, 1791, 80, who said, and I quote, so this is in America, right? This is during 1791, okay? So this was like a speech in a public. And Zapnat Swift, not Pania, sorry, Swift, sorry, Pania is the biblical one. But anyways, on religion of Quran is repugnant as the religion of the Bible is favorable to the human happiness. The Turks who conquered the empire and bowed to the religion of Muhammad have exhibited the blackest picture of human woe, unquote. So this tells us that there was a very, very, open secret in American society that, yes, African slaves, black African slaves, were not treated well. They were treated like animals most of the time. And the double whammy here is that the story of faith and survival seems to be under the same narrative here, where they're being not treated well, okay, whoever were from the Muslim faith too. So, like I said, it's not entirely post 9/11 or the Arab Springs per se, or the Bush's doctrine on Iraq or whatever it is, or Afghanistan. This has been going on for a very long time. As you can see, this is 1791. Okay, so this speech was about abolishing slavery in America, but it's clear that Swift was speaking against Islam. Okay. So many Muslim slaves were forced to convert to Christianity during that time. Some pretended to be Christians. Some were very honest about it, not very sure about it. There are writings of Nicholas said again, and I quote, thinking the way I was baptized was not right, for I think that I ought to have known perfectly well the nature of beforehand. Nicholas said on a Russian experience, Boston, 1867, unquote. That's what he said. So faith and survival in the New World did play a very big role here. I just want to point this out. So another woman here, the lady by the name of Sophie Davis, who was a Muslim slave woman, okay, who continued to practice Islamic faith and their habits, okay, recalls old people praying towards the setting of the sun. So, by the way, I'm not a Muslim. I'm a Christian, but I'm just saying this out of very historical context and my research. So bear with me here. Okay. So we're talking about Sophie Davis. Okay. When she was 8 years old, it was during the early years of Civil War, and she remembers old people praying at sunrise and sunset, and ended their prayers by saying "Mina, Mina, Mo," unquote. Another another Muslim slave woman, her name is Edthrope, okay, Edthrope. You can actually have it, you can research about it. which is who was an 83 years old and a former slave. She remembers her grandma Spalding, patient Spalding, telling her stories about Africa when she was young. Okay, so she recalls her grandmother in her words, "When my grand pray, she knelt down on the floor. She bowed her head down 3 times and she say, Amen, Amen, Amen." So Amen is the Muslim equivalent of Amen, okay, for Christians, okay. Um, okay, so let me cut this short here. So we have another, so there's Rachel Anderson as well. Okay, then you have Rosa Graham's grandmother Raina. Then you have a lot of women slaves, Muslim slaves, that needs to be actually dug out and joined. Let them join the narrative per se. Okay, which needs a lot of work for the gaps to be filled. This is my whole point here. So, I was saying something about the livelihood, okay, how people were living in, in the new world per se. And, so by the way, the whole slave narrative, a lot of people have said there are also arguments about, being the slave narrative as a very romantic kind of, storytelling. But in a sense, I truly believe academically that, it is very non-fictional. It is very, literature based. It has a lot of songs. It has a lot of flavor. It has a lot of, morals, and lessons to, as we forget to, actually study about it, and know, what here. Okay. Okay. So I'm just going to point out a little bit about the runaway slave. Whilst many slaves struggled to survive the New World, there were also slaves who ran away, and some of them were runaway slaves like Osman Squash, Squash, and Osman. So I'm not going to talk too much about the runaway slaves, but you can actually do a research on it, and you can find some interesting stories. Austin, in his book, African Muslims in Antebellum America, has devoted on the study of Bilali from the Sapelo Islands during the antebellum United States. So Sapelo Islands is kind of like an island, actually. I'm not sure exactly where it is, but it should be not far away from America, I think, or South America. Bilali is actually one of the slaves who was, freed, and he moved to the island, and actually, he lived a pretty good life with his family. And there's like a whole museum and all that kind of stuff. All right. Okay, so let's just wrap it up here. What I wanted to point out is, Muslim slaves struggled to preserve their faith, okay, in the New World. Some of them converted to Christianity and some didn't, okay. They formed their own ummah, or Muslim community in the could be in hidingly or secretly in somewhere in Carolina, or Kentucky or Mississippi per se. They must have had their own community, and they were practicing their faith secretly and living a life of servitude. Okay. Michael A. Gomez, in the article Muslims in Early America, he explains how runaway slaves had an ethnic Muslim traits in their names. Okay. It's very interesting because some of the records that I actually found upon the name of names of Muslim slaves during my research was very interesting. For example, Gomez, he points out some of the names also, such as Bullay, B-U-L-L-A-L-Y, Buleli, okay, or Bulele. I hope I'm pronouncing it right, which means Bilali, okay. And you have Mustafa. Okay, you have Sambo, you have Bokare or Bubakar, for in English term it would be Abu Bakr, okay. And you have Mamado. or Mamadou, okay, but in the English pronunciation, you would say or Muhammad, okay. These are regularly observed in the advertisement of the runaway slaves, okay. Like those days, masters of slave owners used to, put up advertisements when their slaves ran away. So one has to question where the runaway slaves went, okay. I think some of the research and some of the narrative of the gaps that we authors, we academicians, people who are interested in history, who are interested in the slave narrative, I think the next step for this research is to actually trace out the names, trace out the master's names, the address, and all that kind of things, and sort of proceed in this, in this train of thought. And it'd be interesting actually to to find out where they're kind of seeking their refuge, or where they were seeking their refuge. Actually, it is also believed, as far as is concerned, these runaway slaves, most of the names like Bubakar, or Ben or Job Ben Solomon. By the way, the Ben, it's a Muslim name, and I always kind of think about the Ben's rice. You never know. He might have, a stake on it, on the Ben's rice. By the way, there's like a black guy, African guy, in the picture of the Ben's rice. If you didn't know, which is sold in America, by the way. So, according to Kambis Ghanea Basiri, in the book A History of Islam in America, From the New World to the New World Order, he points out that there seems to have been interactions, okay, possible of some historical significance, okay, between the African Muslim runaways and the Native Americans. Advertisements in Savannah, Georgia, for example, mention runaways with Muslim names who had taken refuge with Native Americans. One, Muhammad, was said to have been there years after his flight at the settlement near the Indian line of Ogachi, unquote. So, I think it'll be nice to sort of gather some information regarding, those runaway slaves and their names, and I think I'm sure there are records of it. But nevertheless, I think, the faith in survival and, world was it's not easy, right? Some of the slaves even wrote in the walls in their prisons in Arabic because these Muslim slaves knew how to write, and people were very amazed about it, and so on and so forth. Donning on the Moorish costume where they seemed, prince from some other world. All that, psychological game warfare, and by the way, they were even like sort of like a message, a genie in the message, where they used to, send out, secret like writings in the pouches, and I think I do have a pouch here, the picture of it. So these Muslims who were literate, it's called gris gris, okay? It's an amulet of the West African, it's a West African, okay? So this is like a bag where, these Muslim slaves used to write down like, probably the Quran, some of the books or they even used to write messages secretly and pass it on from one to another, so the word is out. So I'm not going to speak much about that now, but to come into conclusion here, the gap that I just spoke to you about, which is, where there's very less literature and there's very less writings and authors and, sources and articles about the Muslim slaves and in America, seems to be a problem, and I think delve more into it, and maybe we can learn from that. Yeah. So yeah, I hope you. And maybe next time I'll talk to you about something else besides history. Please feel free to comment down below, and you can give me suggestions, and you can follow up on my podcast, and you can ask me questions. I'll be more than happy to, and maybe we can have a debate and try to come up with a solution, or carry on with the narrative. All right, well, I'll talk to you guys. I'll see you here in podcast again. All right. All right.